This podcast is part of the Blueberry Network. Blueberry.com is where listeners and podcasters come together. Check it out at blueberrywithnoease.com.
So the Earbud U podcast, while fun to put together, doesn't run for free. And while we're happy to be a new member of the Blueberry Network, we'd like you, our faithful listeners, to do something for us. If you're thinking about engaging with podcasting either now or in the future, and you're stuck on a hosting company, Blueberry is for you. Look, there are a lot of podcast distribution companies out there that are going to make you a lot of promises. But Blueberry offers three things that made it my go-to when starting the Earbud U podcast. Number one, convenience. With the PowerPress plugin and WordPress integration, it works with around 90% of all websites out there. Number two, optimization. Yeah, it took me a while to accept that Apple and iTunes pretty much rule the roost when it comes to podcast distribution. But after I came to that realization, Blueberry was great at making everything very, very easy. Number three, publishing and distribution is simple. Look, I have a lot of stuff going on in my life. I design corporate trainings, I give speeches, I write blog posts, and occasionally I get to see Mrs. Earbud U and the kids. But with Blueberry, publishing my podcast was done and over in 3 easy steps. No muss, no fuss, no bother. Look, head on over to blueberry.com, no ease, and type in the promo code earbud_u, and they'll give you a month of hosting service for free on me. You can't beat that deal with a stick. That's blueberry.com, no ease, and type in the promo code earbud_u. And now, on with the show. Fear, avoidance, escalation, and getting out of our own way. In a conflict, there are two primary movers, fear and power. Fear moves a conflict forward or backward or to the side through resistance, panic, aggressiveness, and avoidance. Power moves a conflict forward or backward or to the side via domination, aggressiveness, passive aggressiveness, and even outright confrontation. Now, power, which is something that everybody knows but no one can really identify, is sometimes confused with motivation and empowerment, especially when power is used and abused by abrasive leaders. Welcome to the show. This is Earbud U, Season 2, Episode number 9. Before I go much further into the intro, for this, our last episode of Season 2, I'd like to thank you, the listener, for listening to our show. We appreciate the feedback that you give us about all the technical changes and technical details that we've made over the last couple of years, the last couple of seasons. We also appreciate the fact that you actually listen to the show and, give us feedback via email. When you retweet our episodes, when you share our episodes on Facebook, and even when you comment on our posts on Instagram. We really do appreciate it, and we look forward to even more in Season 3. Season 2 has been a great season for Earbud U. We got out of our inaugural Season 1 with some hiccups, and we get into Season 2, and we're just becoming more technically proficient here. We're even having better interviews and better guests. I mean, we had our big 2-part episode to kick off our season with Neil Denny talking about grudges and patience and entrepreneurship, and Pattie sort of rounds that out. We also talked to Dr. Joey Cope and Chris Strub, his journey through 50 states in 100 days, and we'll have him back on, perhaps even next season. We talked with Danya Zimmerman in a tale of redemption and reconciliation and coming to terms with your own self, kind of the way that our nation was doing this summer. We talked with Elizabeth Clements, who, gave us a rousing rendition and a rousing thought process around how entrepreneurship and mediation can really get together. We talked to Yvette Durazo about mediating in multiple languages. We had our mix-ups and our hiccups, but we still got a good conversation with Ben Giordano. Finally, we talked with Nicholas Jackson, and Nick taught us all about money and what that means for an artist and what it really means for a children's illustrator working in the world today. So, our last Earbud U episode of the season is with Pattie Porter. Now, in many organizations, with departments, teams, committees, and even individuals, people, it seems, make decisions about changes and innovations because of their perceptions around both fear and power. Now, such perceptions and even misperceptions within different organizations sometimes lead to a lack of genuine leadership. They lead to work being done badly or not at all, and they also lead to innovation being stymied. Unfortunately, as long as people are around to create hierarchical chains of command, fear and power will be the two prime movers of conflict. Our guest for our show today, Pattie Porter, faces these issues head-on. As a person who works almost exclusively with cultural clashes, abrasive supervisors, and HR departments in all types of organizations, from NASA to higher education. Pattie is also an accomplished podcaster, and she has her own show, the Texas Conflict Coach online radio show on Blog Talk Radio, and she actually benefited and sort of helped us out here at Earbud U by having us be interviewed on her show all the way back in, I believe it was October. Now, she agreed to come on our show and do us a solid, and so we have her here now. And we can't wait to listen to her and to have you listen to her talk about sort of how to understand fear and power with abrasive managers. Look, the key thing to understand when you're dealing with somebody who's operating in a paradigm of both fear and power is that they are looking for a pre-programmed evolutionary response from you. And when a different response is provided, then the balance of fear and power shifts from the person instigating the pre-programmed response to the person generating the pre-programmed response. This becomes the core of the dance of conflict, driven by fear and power. And when the balance is successfully tipped or shifted, the game changes. Look, Pattie knows about all of this, and she's tilling the field of peace building in order to engage with conflict competency as a skill set for leaders and as a skill set for everyone. Pattie bookends the second season of Earbud U, as we said before, and she closes off really the first interview that we did with Neil Denny way back in episode 1 when we talked about grudges. We'll have the links to her podcast and all the different ways that you can connect with her through Conflict Connections, through Twitter, through the Texas Conflict Coach website. We'll have all those links below the media player, below this episode, in the show notes as we usually do. But once again, to you, our faithful listeners, thank you. Thank you for sticking with us through the second season of Earbud U. And please tell a friend. Tell 10 friends. Increase those downloads. Get them going. And we look forward in Season 3 to helping you continue to get your knowledge on through your earbuds. All right, then. That's it. For the last time in Season 2, let's get into it.
Welcome to Earbud U, Season 2, Episode number 9. Get your knowledge on through your earbuds. Our special guest for our show today is Pattie Porter. Pattie is a trainer, broadcaster, blogger, and business owner. Pattie is a licensed clinical social worker and has worked in the dispute resolution and conflict resolution field for over 20 years. She provides mediation, training, facilitation, and conflict management coaching for individuals, business leaders, and government agencies. She has worked with the University of Delaware, the University of Texas Austin, the Texas Department of Transportation, and even NASA. Pattie also hosts her own podcast radio show, the Texas Conflict Coach, for the Blog Talk Radio Network. We have been sort of circling around Pattie on Twitter for about the last couple of years, and I'm very excited to have her in the Earbud U studios today. Welcome to Earbud U, Pattie.
Oh, thank you, Jesan. I'm so excited to finally get to meet you in person and talk with you via Twitter. We, like you said, we've been following each other for a couple of years, so I'm so excited to be on your Earbud University Season 2.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, thank you. So I kind of laid out some things for our listeners, but why don't you tell us, for our listeners, what is it that you do exactly?
Well, I am, my primary hat is a conflict management practitioner. I am very passionate about what I do in helping others intervene where conflict has become very destructive and dysfunctional, and they ask me to come in. So, what exactly do I do? So, most of my intervention work, I have a full-time practice as a conflict management practitioner. People will, I primarily work in the workplace sector, business world, whether that's a government agency or a private business. And essentially, people, ring me up and say, we're having a problem. And depending on what the assessment of the problem is, I might go in and intervene as a conflict coach, working one-on-one with an individual, usually some type of an executive. I might be providing intervention in terms of facilitating group intervention with teams that are having a lot of conflict. I might be going in as a facilitator doing organizational change management because there's a lot of conflict that's resolved, that has come as a result of this, maybe a merger or whatnot. I might be mediating between a supervisor employee regarding some type of discrimination or EEO complaint. And when I'm not doing intervention work, usually I'm doing a lot of conflict-related training, whether that's negotiation, problem solving, mediation, conflict coaching. I also teach conflict coaching at the graduate level at Southern Methodist University. And of course, when I'm not doing any and all of those things, I'm a radio show host. And I also published my first mini book last year. So now I'm an author. And finally, as part of my radio show, I about 2 years ago, because I've been doing it 6 years now, but about 2 years ago, I developed a relationship with the University of Baltimore and having graduate interns from their dispute resolution program working with us on our community outreach program. And so now I've also been mentoring a number of graduate students, and that's been an unexpected, nice relationship to mentor interns because I had a lot of mentors. And so that's definitely been added to my number of hats that I wear. So that's kind of it in the nutshell. It keeps me very busy.
Awesome. Yeah. I mean, it sounds like you're sort of, well, not sort of all over the place, but it sounds like, you're definitely out there. What, let's break this down a little bit. So you said you go into businesses and you're working with organizations. Are you working more with, when you do their coaching, do you take more of a systems approach or more of a sort of I'm going to work with you one-on-one to make you a better person approach?
Well, I mean, every situation's differently. Typically, the call is from an HR person or employee relations. Usually it's an HR person or senior executive who will call me because they're in crisis. And the crisis could be any number of things. So when they call, the first thing is I don't, it's like you go to the doctor's office and say, hey, my heart hurts. And the patient goes in and says, hey, I need open heart surgery. And the doctor's like, wait, let's take a step back here. Let's do an assessment first to see what's really going on, because maybe you're having a panic attack and you don't need open heart surgery, right? So the first thing I do is I really just listen and ask some really good questions about doing an initial assessment on the phone. And before I do recommend any type of intervention, is really understanding what is the problem first. And so that's the first thing I do, is a full assessment with the person that's calling me in, and based on what it is they're asking for, because a lot of times they'll call in and says, we need a training. And I asked, why do you want a training? Well, we've got this problem going on, but we thought if everyone would just, if we put the problem child in the training room, maybe they'll get it. Maybe they'll get it, and usually they don't, because they're in the back of the room with they're texting and they don't want to be there. And so they're not only are they not getting it, but they're not solving the problem. And so that's always been the first step, is really assessing what is the issue. And part of it is under helping them understand what their own fear is. In other words, what's HR and the leadership's own fear about actually doing some intervention work. And so I've always have to address their own fears first before they're like, okay, I guess we should do conflict coaching or mediation or facilitated dialogue or whatever it is. But it's addressing those fears that they have first.
Okay, this is one of my favorite topical areas. I've blogged on it quite a bit. I'm fascinated by fear in organizations. And I mean, obviously, you have individuals who have fear. And I do. When I go into workshops, and when I do workshops in organizations, because I'm kind of in the same space that you are, when I get called, I do the listening part first, just like you're talking about. And then, I also do a little bit of a sort of an informal assessment. And then I'll sort of kick back some analysis to the HR person who's meeting with me. Actually, I just had a meeting a couple of weeks ago with somebody in this exact same space, and I'll kick them back a suggestion or an idea for how we can proceed to move forward. And typically, I get blank stares. Like that's typically like the first response. And then after that, there's the, oh no, I don't think we're ready to go that far. And those responses come from a place of fear. So talk to me about your opinion on fear in organizations. Why are so many organizations so fearful when we live in an era of rapid change, rapid innovation, and maybe that's part of what's leading to the fear? Is it just the resistance? Is it just that whole like, we like the way things are and we're going to keep it this way? Or is it more about, if the organization had to change, then I would have to change? Is it more of that personal kind of thing that you're seeing?
Well, I think that in my experience of the types of situations I deal with, which is a pretty broad range of issues, the fear is a number of things. The fear is, let's say HR is calling the fear for them is, they really don't have the power and decision-making authority a lot of times that senior leaders will give them. And so their senior leaders are dictating, we just need to get the problem resolved. Well, that means shoving it under the rug or whatever. So the fear is if we do something more, we're going too far. That means, are we really opening Pandora's box and it's going to make it worse? That's one of the biggest fears, is that we just want to be quiet and try to do something and not like really get to the problem, because the problem could really show its ugly head, that the problem is really not that person. Really, it could be that the problem is that person is trying to survive in the cultural environment, and it shines light that there's problems in the cultural environment, and that's bigger than we can deal with right now. So we just got to survive in the environment that they deal with. So one, opening up Pandora's box. Another fear is conflict. People are afraid of confrontation and the ugliness of, can we have these conversations in a productive way? They don't know how to have those conversations in a productive way. And so they're afraid that, they're going to lose control or lose power, or that it now means that if we change this one thing for this individual, that means it changes it for the team, the organization. So the thing is as you're saying, change happens all the time, and yet they're afraid of change.
Right.
Because it might go in a different direction than they really don't want to put energy, money, time, effort in. So there's a lot of there's that fear of, not being liked. HR wants to be liked, or the person who we're dealing with wants to be liked. So there's a lot of different fears that are going on. But I would say the biggest thing is confronting the situation. Fear of opening Pandora's box, or fear that if they open it, that it's going to lead to retaliation from the employee, suing them, or someone getting fired, or going up the level of litigation or formal complaints, and they're just wanting to keep it as a secret and keep it quiet. But by avoiding it, they're actually contributing to the escalation of the situation and the problem. So fear is a big one for sure.
Fear is huge. I see and I work with small and medium-sized organizations, so anywhere between 50 to 500 employees. I mean, not small, small companies, small cultures, local company, and then very local, obviously. And when you're dealing with something really in that small an area, I'm not talking about like Coca-Cola or anything like that, or or NASA. We'll get to that in a second. I wanted to talk to you about NASA because that's fascinating to me. You and Brad Heckman are the only two people that I know who worked with NASA, so I got to ask you about that. But when you're talking about fear, particularly in a smaller organization, there's a lot. I get a lot of pushback of, well, we're all family here, and then that's just sort of like, well, yeah, but family's the first organization. That's typically what I push back with. Family's the first organization. Tell me, how well do you get along with your mother and father?
Or mother-in-law and father-in-law.
Or mother-in-law and father-in-law. Talk to me about your relationships and how you're dealing with that. And then let's make that personal inside of this space so you can understand sort of the intervention that I'm talking about. You mentioned power. I wrote my thesis, and I've talked about this before on the podcast, but I wrote my thesis on power, 186 pages on power. How do you see power? Because I'm fascinated by power, and to me, it's the corollary to go along with fear. So how do you see those two kinds of things playing out in your interventions? Because you're working with executives, and you're also working with the HR folks. How are you seeing the power play out in organizations when you do your mediation work or your change management work?
Well, it's really interesting because, power means a lot of different things. And, from an individual perspective, like if I'm working one-on-one in executive coaching, especially because one of the things I specialize is in abrasive leader coaching. So that's more than just conflict. That's, ingrained behaviors where executives are using aggressive behaviors to get employees to perform. And so the tendency is for them to use power over people instead of power with people to motivate. And so when they are in a position of power to manipulate and to intimidate and to humiliate and to demean and using those, they think that's motivation to get them to do more, when in reality, when they're holding power over people, it's actually diminishing them and disempowering them, and can be in a very destructive way. And when someone has power, let's say there's a number of abrasive leaders who have power because they've been with an organization for years, and they are well known in the community. They're well known with colleagues outside of the organization, and so they have brought a lot of great public light to the program or the organization or the business that they're dealing with, and so they're seen very differently from those outside folks who've then given credibility to the program that they lead or the organization that they lead. But within the organization, they're known as a terror. They're known, as someone to be afraid of. And so it's a dichotomy between how can we get rid of someone like this because they brought in so much money and they brought in years of experience and they bring in all this, positive public light, but inside it's having devastating effects. People are quitting, people are being fired, people are afraid, people are shifting around, employee turnover is high. But then at what point from upper senior leadership do they say, the costs are too high, and when do we stop? Because right. The power, is used in a very negative, destructive way. So that's how a lot of times I see that. But even in cultural, organizations, there's a lot of organizations that I work with, especially like in government, but not just government, where there are two cultures at play. So, for example, I might be in an organization let's say Department of Defense, where you have the military personnel who have a very specific type of structure and value-based system in which they work in their culture, very hierarchical chain of command, and yet they also have a civilian population that works many of the administrative and leadership positions. And when you have the civilian culture and the military culture working side by side, is an example of culture clashes. Or when you're working in an environment like NASA, you have a lot of scientists, right? Very, very extremely
smart
intelligent, smart individuals who are technically brilliant individuals, but maybe not have the people skills or the emotional intelligence or the conflict competence in which to deal with the everyday people dynamics. And so there's that, people side of the organization in NASA or the post office, and then this very, scientific community, or in a university, you've got the faculty and then you've got the staff, so you have all these culture clashes, where the power dynamic of, well, I'm better than you, or, somehow they put themselves above the other culture. And that is a constant conflict, regardless whether it's a small business, like even a family business. Well, we're the family, we're the family business owners, but we have non-family who works in the business, and yet somehow they don't have, equal dynamics. So it doesn't matter if it's a family business, a government structured organization, a university, a scientific research community. Constantly there's those cultural clashes. Yeah,
constant cultural clashes. Well, and one of the things I blog about is that culture matters, and it's interesting to me sort of how, and I read a lot of business stuff, and you talk about HR. Actually, it triggered something in me. You may want to pick up the July-August issue of Harvard Business Review, because they did an entire thing on HR. And their entire sort of the entire articles, or all of the articles in the Harvard Business Review for July and August of 2015 were really focused on, can HR be saved? Is it time for HR in the United States to sort of evolve past what they're currently doing and evolve into something else? And I listened to a great podcast interview with one of the guys who wrote one of the main articles. And this was basically his point, was that, and I can't remember his name right off the top of my head, I think it's Eric something, but he was saying that, yeah, HR has got to evolve. HR has got to start being at the table inside of these power and cultural conversations, and they've got to move past just being involved with onboarding and recruiting and sort of really being in these narrow, tiny silos, and really move out into other things if they want to continue to be a legitimate, influential part of the organization. Because organizations will just move right past them and go to doing whatever it is that they want to do, and you won't get that cultural change that you're talking about.
I actually heard recently that those who are in HR, especially who get their certification through the Society for Human Resource Management, that one of their core competencies that they have now changed is for them to become conflict competent, if you will, to incorporate conflict management and resolution as a core competency in their certification, which really opens the world for me in how I work with HR professionals now, because they see that as a critical element, skill set for themselves and how they're dealing with conflict, and not just a referral source.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Well, let's shift gears a little bit here, because I could talk about this forever, but let's shift gears a little bit.
Exactly.
And I could literally talk about this forever. But you're involved in a lot of other different areas. I mean, you're teaching, you're mentoring, you're also an entrepreneur. I consider you an entrepreneur. And you're podcasting, you're doing that. How did you fall into the business end? So talk to us through sort of developing your business practice and your business approach, and what sort of led you down that path. I'm a process-oriented guy, so sort of break it down for me. How did you go from idea to implementation?
Well, the first thing in the core is, and that always centers me, is conflict is my world, right? Conflict management, conflict resolution, and all aspects of what conflict creates. So that is the core of everything I do, whether it's writing about conflict, podcasting about conflict, teaching about conflict. So although I do a lot of different things, everything stems from the world of study and theory and application of conflict dynamics. So in terms of developing my business, it was about, 2001 is when I actually formed the business Conflict Connections. For a long time, I was just, Patricia Porter, Pattie Porter. And I was in Delaware at the time. I was living in Delaware for 9 years and had gone through my master's of social work degree. There was not, in the mid-90s, early to mid-90s, there were no master's or bachelor's programs for that matter. I don't think there was a PhD program that I was aware of in dispute resolution. So I had gotten my master's in social work because I knew I was wanting to be in the helping profession. So I was doing a lot of mediation work in particular at that time, and a lot of facilitation work. I was working through the conflict resolution program at the University of Delaware, and I was doing that part time, and then I started taking on some work on the side as a consultant. And so that's what I was doing, is getting a lot of organizations are like, hey, we really need someone to help us with this. Is this something you can do? And at first, like most people who hear about mediation and they're like, oh, I want to have a full-time mediation business, and when I first started getting into the world of mediation, this is before I really understood about other conflict intervention processes like facilitation, and this is before even conflict coaching came about. I knew enough about myself and the work in workplaces or organizations. The feedback and resistance I was getting from a lot of organizations is, we don't want mediation. That was scary for them, right?
That's scary.
That was mediation. What's mediation? Oh, isn't that something legal? Oh my God, and so even though I was just like mediation, they were like, no. And I'm like, okay, right off the bat, I'm like, okay, why are they so resistant to mediation? It was this fear again, this is a legal thing. Oh, we don't want to go that far. Mediation, that was a scary concept.
Is the lawyer going to be there? Oh my God.
Exactly, and that was even back in the early 90s. And so right off the bat, I was just like, how can I diversify in terms of what I'm, offering organizations? I already knew I wanted to work in an organization, in the workplace, whatever that looked like. It had to be a workplace-related conflict. And what I was finding out right away is businesses are like, mediation is not a one size fits all. Do you offer other things? Now, initially it was training. So then I was like, okay, I need to be able, as a business, if I'm thinking about developing a business, I need to think about what is the range of menu, if you will, a menu of services that would be the right fit for whatever it is that they believe is the problem. And so right off the bat, I knew that I could offer training, mediation, and facilitation were the first three things I knew I could offer right away, depending on what the situation was that they were bringing. Was it one-on-one? Was it really two individuals not getting along? Was it just one person who needed someone to talk to? And at that time, it was counseling, not coaching, because that was not conflict coaching. It was just really starting to be heard of in the late 90s. And so right off the bat, when I developed Conflict Connections in 2001, I knew right away I was going to offer a menu of services. And so because of that, I started really developing various intervention techniques based on whether it was an individual, a group, a small group, etc. And that's kind of how I started. And then eventually in the late 90s, when I started hearing about coaching, and then took Cindy Noble's Synergy Conflict Management Coaching in the early 2000s. I was already doing my counseling work as a licensed clinical social worker through an employee assistance program at the University of Delaware, and already had an audience to start using my conflict coaching, and that took off immediately because people again had a negative implication about, I got to go to an EAP for counseling, when really they were dealing with conflict with their supervisor or their coworker, and right away the conflict coaching was a smashing hit because to them it felt like it was very future oriented, goal oriented, and action oriented versus let's look at your past and your family, and so that conflict coaching part really took off and was really appealing to a lot of organizations.
Okay. So when you talk about the coaching and you talk about sort of how that took off, how did you come about? Like, did you start with workshops and trainings as sort of your entree into those organizations, or did you just sort of run at it in sort of a sales kind of way, or was it more of a, I got to get a pile of books here and I got to read about sales? How did you get into that?
Are you kidding me? Sales? Forget that. I mean, most of us entrepreneurs, I'll speak for me.
Yeah.
For me, as an entrepreneur, I never really saw myself as an entrepreneur in that way. I just saw myself as a practitioner. I wanted to practice. I didn't want, I'm like, yeah, okay, I got, the reason I came up with Conflict Connections versus Patricia Porter's, everyone says you need to formalize, you need to form a business. I'm like, Okay, and then there's the whole creative, conflict connections, and there's a whole story about that. But once I became Conflict Connections, the whole marketing, the whole sales, to me, that was a nasty word. Oh, I'm not a salesperson. I'm not going to sell myself. I'm not going to, no way am I going to touch that. I'm hoping someone will just knock on my door because let's just let it happen, because the idea of selling was a very scary thought for me. And I thought it was bad, dirty water, it's just like, oh, there's no way I'm going to go out in there. And then the whole thing of marketing and sales and advertising, that was a whole new world for me. And I was just like, I most of my work thankfully came as word of mouth in Delaware, when I was in Delaware, because I was already known for doing that work. And then when I formalized, people would just give me, give me work, or I had really good networks nationally through the Association for Conflict Resolution. It wasn't until I moved back to Texas, when now I was back home, but I was actually in a new city, so no one knew who I was. And then this whole concept of, well, you're an entrepreneur. And I'm like, well, I guess I am, and, and I'm like, I just want to practice. Do I really have to do all this business stuff, And so that was a real eye-opener, because I'm like, okay, if I really want people to understand what it is I do and understand how it can help them, then what do I need to do around marketing and even still less about sales for me. It was more about, how do I market myself? How do I tell people without shoving it down their throat? So that was something I resisted for years. And so it wasn't until I was here, when I moved back to Texas in 2006, I think it was, and I was pretty isolated, meaning most of my work was traveling in the United States. So I was constantly leaving San Antonio, and the only people I knew other than my husband and my neighbors, I didn't know anybody. I had not networked. I didn't do any of that stuff. I hadn't social media, nothing. And I was always on the road. So I always felt disconnected when I came home and isolated. And basically someone said, you should try co-working. Some people don't know what co-working is, but it was the idea that entrepreneurs of different backgrounds and different kinds of businesses that they had would come to a common space called co-working. And so I thought, okay, let me go co-work. And the first one in San Antonio was at a local coffee house that wasn't too far from where I lived. And the first day I think I got there was 4, 5, 6 people there, and and the idea is you're supposed to work, you're doing your work, but you're also kind of connecting with other people in different backgrounds. And the very first co-working, I met a lady, her name was Jennifer Navarrete, and she was into social media, which I absolutely had no clue what that was. It's the typical, you're having your coffee, well, what do you do, and what do you do? And so we were listening and inquiring, and as she's telling me about social media and Facebook and Twitter and LinkedIn and some of these things back in 2006,
yeah,
I was like, listening, not understanding what she was saying to me. I thought it was Greek, and literally at the end of the conversation I said, I really appreciate the time you took to tell me what you do. I said, but I feel like I'm leaving the planet Mars. I mean, that's what I told her. I said, I have no idea what you just told me, and I'm not sure how that applies to my business. And she goes, don't worry, you'll learn. And it took the next year of just these co-working spaces where she would give me these little tips, like she knew I traveled, and she says, you know what, I want you to go buy a webcam. That was back before webcams were in your laptops. And she said, I want you to buy a webcam, and I want you to download Skype. And every time you're at a hotel, you can use your webcam and Skype to talk to your husband. I was like, oh, I can do that by video? Really? That was like new for me, And I'm like, okay, so she'd give me these little bitty things, because electronics and all technology was a little scary for me. And that's how it started. So it took about a year for me to start to understand how social media might be used for my business development. And finally, I decided to hire her as a social media coach. about a year later, or maybe it was a year and a half later, just to hire as a social media coach to like literally sit down next to me, hold my hand, open up my accounts. We opened the first big three: Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn, and understanding how that works. And I remember we were sitting at my dining room table. I had a cup. I love coffee. I drink Jamaican Blue Mountain is my favorite. We're sitting there drinking Jamaican Blue Mountain, and I said, we're on Twitter, and I'm like, okay, what do I write? She says, well, what are you doing? I said, I'm sitting here drinking Jamaican Blue Mountain coffee with you. She goes, okay, type that. I'm like, who cares? And I'm like, okay, I'll write that. But, so very quickly I learned it's about building relationships. It's about letting people know who you are. It's about sharing information. It's about educating, I was all about education. So that's how I started with social media. And then another year went by, and she told me about her podcasting and her own radio show she had been doing for years. And because she'd been trying to get me to blog, and I'm like, I hate writing. That was definitely not part of my, repertoire. I was good at writing, but I didn't like it. There was a lot of my own fear and stuckness in that. She goes, well, then you should do a radio show first. If I'm not going to write, yes, show. I'm like, you crazy person. And that took another year for her to convince me that I should be doing a radio show. But anyway, let me stop there. That I could go on all kinds of different places.
No, this is good because you know what, like 2006, 2008, those were the dare I say the golden era. If you got into social media and you got into that as a piece of as a marketing channel for your business, that was the golden era. I mean, 2006 to 2008, that was a really good time to be a new person, to be sort of jumping in. There weren't too many networks. I mean, Facebook had just started to creep into the public consciousness. Twitter wasn't quite there yet. LinkedIn hadn't done a whole lot of acquisitions. And now in 2015, 9 years later, actually, things have exploded all over the place. And so you got someone like me who came into the field in 2000 and, I got my master's degree in 2011, but, didn't start my business until 2013. Sometimes it's like, you got to learn all these platforms and things are changing every day. And I like that. I get engaged by that. I get energized by learning that and by having that new knowledge. And for me, for my creativity piece, because my bachelor's degree is in fine arts. So for me, the creativity piece comes out in there because I get to be creative inside of all these little platforms doing all these different things and stuff like that. And now you've got streaming video with Meerkat and Periscope. So, I could definitely see a day when a person coming into our profession or into our field streams live a mediation session or streams live a coaching session or does live streaming coaching with a bunch of different people all across the country or all across the globe.
Well,
that gets into other things about self-determination and all kinds of things. But I could definitely see someone taking that leap as a business model and really incorporating that piece into their business and being successful with it.
Well, in the dispute resolution field, which is where I associate myself with, it's always so funny that a lot of my colleagues or people who know of me through the radio show in particular, they're like, "Oh, you're leading the field and all this cutting edge things," and I'm like, I don't see myself that way, but they're like, "Oh, you're the Texas conflict coach, or you're the Pattie Porter." I'm like, where do they get that? In my mind, I'm like, I'm just doing social. I'm just trying to keep up like everybody else, and they're like, but you're blazing the field into social media because now we're in Google Plus and Reddit and all these things, and I'm like now, unlike you, where you were already, grabbing onto the creativity of social media and getting creative with all these things, I was just like kind of kicking and screaming, "Oh God, do I have to do this?" But by being fearless, by saying, you know what, I'm not going to be my grandparents, or they're like, "Oh, I'll just use the candlestick phone," I'm like, no, I can't be afraid of technology. I've got to just embrace it. I've got to learn it. Whatever the technology is, whether it's social media, whether it's learning how to use Powtoons for, Powtoons is now a cartoon automated way of presenting versus, the old PowerPoint, whatever the technology is, or video streaming and all of those kinds of things, is just not about being afraid. Now, sometimes I don't have the time to learn it on my own. So I'm like, okay, I'm a coach. People hire me to be a coach. So I'm going to hire a social media coach, a business coach, a writing coach, or whatever kind of coach just to help me along. Is use those resources to help you. And I've hired a number of coaches over the years, whether I'm working with a writing coach right now, because like I said, I hated coaching. He goes, you need to write. But because of the writing coach, I had, produced my first mini book last year, and I've already sold over 1,000 copies, and I'm on my second book now. So you have to hire those kind of people to help you.
Let's talk about writing. I love to write, and that's where my creative.
And you're a good blogger too.
A blogger. I mean, I wrote a blog post last year, and I've talked about this before here, but I wrote a blog post last year about just how I'm going to blog whether people read it or not, because I'm working things out, and it gives me an opportunity to sort of work things out in public. But one of the things about blogging is that's the basis for a book. And so looking at your writing practice, how has that shifted? Because you said you've got a writing coach. So how has that shifted things around for you?
I think how that shifted is because, my writing coach, he's a business and a writing coach, and he says, Pattie, if you're wanting to build a, let's say for him, he says, if you're a coach and you want to build a 6-figure practice, he says, one of the things you need to do is get out there and write so that people, recognize your credibility as an author. And he goes, you have such a wealth of knowledge in your head. He goes, you need to get that out there. And of course, my first thought was, well, what could I write that hasn't been already written? Why would I just write the same thing that's already out there? And so we had this process of understanding that what I have is a value just like anybody else. And how do I put my style and my words and my knowledge into that experience? And so we started with writing articles and getting published on Jesan, which is a great way of getting exposure on the internet as an author. And then we started writing tips. And then every week I would write tips, and that would become part of either a short article or a short blog. And then that became the emphasis of my first mini book. And when I say mini book, it's like a pocket-sized book. The first one was called Stop the Dreaded Drama, 55 Tips for Ending Destructive Conflict. And so it took about a year of just going through that tedious process of writing, and just because I get stuck. I get on the computer, okay, I'm supposed to write the first paragraph, and I will probably sit there for 30 minutes thinking, what am I going to write about? And it was just getting through that initial, and he would say, don't even think about it, just write it all out, just whatever, free flow. And so through that coaching and guidance, it took me a year to finally get those 55 tips, and then the whole process of how do I publish that and how do I lay it out. And so there was all that learning curve, and then finding MiniBook, which is the actual printer publisher out of Arizona that helped us put that first one together. And because it then exploded, like I said, I've had over 1,000 book sales in not only the United States, Canada, and we've had some purchases in the UK and Poland. And we just launched last week the mini book as an ebook on Kindle, Nook, and iBooks. So we're very excited about that. And then now I'm writing on my second book on conflict avoidance. So it's been an interesting process, and I think it has. I guess the last thing I wanted to say about the shift in your question is it's really interesting because now people, if I'm presenting, they're like, and she's the author of Stop the Dreaded Drama. And I'm thinking, well, okay, it's a mini book. It's full of content. It's a very rich content. But in my mind, I'm like, but it's a little bitty book, and people are like, oh, it's gold. It's valuable. And it is. It's very valuable content. But in my mind, I'm thinking, maybe I just downplay it or whatever, but for people, they think of it as really important to be an author, and it adds that credibility in my expertise and in the work that I do in conflict.
Well, and when it's become so easy, one of the things that I'm really fascinated by, and we don't really have time to talk about it today, but one of the things that I'm fascinated by is content development and sort of how content gets developed. and I want to shift to talk about the podcast a little bit,
Okay.
how content gets developed, particularly these days where the barriers to entry have gone from here to like, they've just gone down, gone down, gone down, gone down, gone down. So, one of the reasons I attack social with such verve is because, and why I'm so bullish on it for peace builders particularly, is because the barriers to entry no longer exist. So if you want to publish a book, quite frankly, I mean, self-publishing no longer has a stigma attached to it the way that it did. And I don't remember the early 90s. I remember the mid-90s. But the mid-90s, like it did in the mid-90s. I call them the good old days. When I talk to my 18-year-old, I'm like, 1997, that was before all this. Or if you want to stream a video, like, we didn't have the tools in the 90s to stream video. Like, that didn't exist. But still, the written word still has power, and the written word still has value. And this is the reason why, I still continue to blog, why I encourage other mediators to start blogging on a regular basis and start getting their voices out there. Get a typepad blog, costs you $15 a month, $12 a month, something like that. You don't have to do a big old WordPress site. And that gives you a core of content and a core of things being able to be worked out, because one of the ways I see what you're doing and what I'm doing and what, like I mentioned Brad Heckman before, Brad Heckman or Neil Denny and other folks, Elizabeth Clements, other folks in our field are doing, who are really on that cutting edge, is we're really able to, and marketing is just education. We're really able to educate, because it's not as if, there's more conflict, not less. And so, really educating people about how to get out of it, get around it, get through it, get over it, and really breaking it down and breaking down assumptions that we have in our own field. Like, no one's, I love the people that I work with, but I don't recommend Kenneth Polk's books to any of my clients that I work with, because they're great books, but they're not gonna read those. They're too dense. They're too weighty for them. But a mini book, they're gonna read that. They're gonna read the 55 tips. A business owner will read that. A business owner is more likely to listen to the podcast than they are maybe to go do a 40-hour mediation course, or a 2-year long master's degree program, or even send their employees through something like that, because they want those small bits. And you talk about, well, it's just 55, and how people give you the feedback that it's gold. It is gold because it is that small little bits for people that they really want. Whereas us in our field, we want the long form, dense Mediate.com article with the 8,000 references.
Yes.
We want that when we're talking to each other, but the people outside of our field don't want that. They don't want that.
Right. They want to be out of pain. They want to be out of their crisis. They want someone to come fix it for them. And of course, then they realize, they have to fix it themselves. And that's been the thrust of the podcast for me. I mean, all along, my goal has been, even when I was with the ACR, and because I was a leader at ACR, Association for Conflict Resolution, the workplace section, I was one of their tri-chair for a long time, been involved with them for a long time. And our mantra was public education, community outreach. And I'm very passionate about educating the community, the everyday person, about conflict. And so you're right, when it comes to Ken Cloak, Bernie Mayer, some of the top people in our field, I love reading their books for myself. But the everyday person, my neighbor, my coworker, my colleague, my boss, my grocery store clerk, whatever, all they care about is, I just didn't want to be in conflict, And so that was the emphasis of the podcast, and even the mini book is all about not educating mediators, even though a lot of mediators listen to our podcast all the time, like yourself. I think you discovered our podcast, our radio show, because it's rich content from a multidisciplinary approach of guests that come on. So a lot of the guests that come on are not just from the dispute resolution field. They're from all different kinds of fields, but they deal with conflict and helping people out. And so the idea is, how do we just educate the everyday person about, one, not how to be afraid of conflict, how to have these conversations without feeling like they've got to be destructive and dysfunctional, but how to be courageous and fearless about saying what they need and asking for what they need. And that's what the whole intention of the mini book is, and every single podcast, whether it's listening, whether it's negotiation, whether it's, okay, you're going into mediation, what does that mean? Does it have to be a scary thing? If it's about, and then a broad range of issues, whether it's, LGBT issues or going back to school or bullying, it doesn't matter where or when or who, but educating all the various angles of where conflict comes into play, and letting the other everyday person know you can do this. Or if you really think you can't do this, there are people out there that can help you.
Help you, yes. Yes, there are people out there that can help you. Yes, absolutely. Well, clearly, your passion comes through about this work when you talk about it, and when you talk about the clients that you work with. And we didn't really, we didn't do a deep dive into sort of like what exactly it is that you did for NASA and that kind of stuff. But I think we've got a nice broad swath of understanding of what you do and why you do what you do. And like I said, the passion really comes through. My last couple of questions here. What keeps you going? Because sometimes I see mediators and conflict coaches who are burned out. I think of a conflict coach that I know who's in this state, and if I said the name you would know, but who's in the state, who mediated his own divorce. Like, so. And it's one thing for, and hey, and one of the things that I tell clients that I work with is, I have the exact same issues with conflict in my life that you do, the exact same ones. Except the difference between myself and you is I know what the thing is that I need to do, and I know how to reframe. I know how to go the third way. I know how to, focus on the position and the interests and focus on the people, not the problem. Like, I know how to do all that. Do I sometimes make the choice to not do that? Yeah, sometimes that happens. Sometimes I get activated and that just happens. So how do you keep going doing this work? What drives you? Because the passion is there, obviously. And you've got all these vehicles to get the passion out. What drives you? What keeps you going after so many years? Because it's been over 20 years now. What keeps you getting up in the morning and moving one foot forward in front of the other?
Well, I love doing what I do. Obviously, as you said, that comes through in my passion. I'm glad that people still hear that. And there are times where I get burnt out or I need to take a step back and a little bit of a shift and stuff. But what drives me at my core, I talk about this in the mini book, and I talk a little bit about it on the podcast, about what got me started doing this work. I grew up in a very high conflict family. And that really shaped me being, in my early years, very conflict avoidant myself, afraid of authority, afraid of power, afraid of standing up for myself, afraid of, having voice, being able to say what I need, to be in a healthy relationship, all of those things that had a really huge impact. And it wasn't until I started going through a lot of my own counseling and coaching that I understood the power of how I can do this effectively and productively. And so then it became, how can I teach that to others? How can I help others get out of that pain point for them when they're in those types of conflicts? And it's wonderful to be able to see. Sometimes I work with people for months on an end. I can work for an organization and a team for a year. Not just, in and out, like a mediation, you can go in for 8 hours and you're done. And I tend to like with the longer term workplace organizations because you have workplace relationships. So a lot of times I might be working for several months or over a course of a year, and you see that change, and you see not only the change in that individual, not only how they become a more effective a leader, but what they realize is they thought they were a good listener, or they thought they were a good conflict problem solver, and then it's like they were unconsciously incompetent. Then they became aware that they were really incompetent in how to deal with conflict or listen. And then they're like, over time, you see them really develop that awareness and that insight, and they become more empathetic, and they learn how to deal with it more competently and constructively and confidently. And that is a real reward to be able to see that shift and that transformation in them. And that's what keeps me going. Even people say, why do you keep doing the radio show? Because every year I'm like, okay, is this the year? Am I done now? And I keep thinking, okay, God's going to tell me one day, okay, you're done. But the good Lord and everybody else who gives me feedback says, keep doing what you're doing, keep going. And I'm like, okay, another year. So I must be doing something right. If they're finding value in it, I'll keep doing it. So.
Well, I want to thank you for the value that you're providing. I want to thank you for taking the time to come on to Earbud U today. Is there anything that you would like to promote today for our listeners?
I guess I really want to, other than promoting the mini book, Stop the Dreaded Drama, 55 Tips for Ending Destructive Conflict, and folks can find that through their Kindle or on our website at conflictconnections.com. I really just want to promote people being courageous and fearless about conflict. This doesn't mean they have to swing the pendulum and be a bitch or a bear or be aggressive, but to not be afraid of people. People are afraid, of what you're going to say. And so it's about having those honest conversations and be able to just say what it is you need and being able to listen and just really promote not being afraid to just step out in that courage that you have and those skills that you already have to be able to speak up for yourself, but also to be compassionate about the other person and really listen to what their concerns are and not letting that fear get in the way. So that's kind of
awesome.
it. Yeah.
That's awesome. And we'll have links to your Blog Talk Radio show, and we'll have links to conflictconnections.com in the show notes below the show. So I want to thank Pattie for coming on. Again, much like with many of my guests, we've only scratched the surface. I would love to have you on again, and we could talk more about the abrasive leader coaching. I really would like to do a deep dive into that. I started reading Tribal Leadership by Dave Logan, and so that's been really an interesting read. And so I'd like to see sort of what you think about that. But I'd love to have you back on. But thank you for coming on, Pattie. I appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me, Jesan.
And you have a great day.
All right.
Bye-bye.